John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States who was president from 1841 to 1845, has 2 grandchildren who are still alive today. What is a cool historical fact that you think people should know? Egypt, despite being one of the oldest nations on Earth, has only been independent for less than a century. Before that, the last truly independent Egypt was around 300 BC. For over 2,000 years, Egypt was under foreign rule. Heels on shoes were originally worn by butchers, so they didn't step in blood. One time the British Navy kidnapped 2 Maori chiefs in the hope of learning the secrets of Maori rope making. Not realizing that in Maori society rope making was traditionally a woman's job, so these poor chiefs had no idea what they were doing. When hiding a body, you should dig a 5-meter grave, drop the body, fill the grave up until it's 2 meters deep and then put a dead animal inside. Then fill the grave until it's full. You do that because no matter what you do, the dirt is gonna look like it has been dug up. But that way if someone digs the grave again, he will see that he just ruined a pet's grave and he will leave it at peace. But that's not the historical fact I am here for. The historical fact is that the technique mentioned above was invented by pirates during the golden age of piracy. But instead of a body, it was a treasure, and instead of an animal was a body. It's funny how things change. The use of the word hooker as a term for a prostitute originated with Civil War General Joseph Hooker, who brought prostitutes along on campaigns for his men. In 1847, the Choctaw Nation raised $170 for the Irish people, equivalent to thousands of dollars now, to help ease their suffering during the worst year of the Irish famine. This came just after almost half of the Choctaw Nation were lost on the Trail of Tears, as their people were driven from their land by American settlers and perished due to starvation, so they had absolutely nothing, and they sent all this over to a country they didn't even know. Ireland never forgot it and now has a special scholarship scheme for members of the Choctaw Nation to go to college there. In World War II, U-boat crews had the highest mortality rate, 70%, of any military group. After kamikaze pilots. In World War I, many leaders of European countries, Russia, England, Germany, were cousins or at least related because Queen Victoria had 9 children and married many of them off to other kingdoms which became countries. King Henry VIII of England had people who were called grooms of the stool whose job it was to wipe his bottom. During his reign, he had 4 such people, all of whom were knighted. Did you know that at one point during the Second World War, the Germans built fake airfields from wood to trick England and its allies into believing they were more powerful than they actually were? England saw right through this and took the piss out of it by building fake wooden bombs and dropping them on the airfields. There was a Greek woman named Sappho who lived on the island of Lesbos and wrote romantic poetry about her love for women. She had a husband named Kirkylos of Andros, who historians think was made up. She is the reason why lesbians are called lesbians. The apple from the story of Adam and Eve was never specified as an apple in the Bible. Just a fruit from a tree. The apple was picked up in the mid-1200s. John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States who was president from 1841 to 1845, has 2 grandchildren who are still alive today. More than 1/3 of all U.S. presidents have been named John, George, William, or James. Round Earth was generally accepted by all throughout most of history with few exceptions. Columbus thought the Earth was round when he sailed, and those who commissioned him to do so believed the Earth was round also. The whole Columbus believed the Earth was flat. The thing came from Protestants making propaganda against Catholics to look stupid. Not sure how cool but definitely funny. When Khosrau I destroyed Antioch, he took precise measurements of all the buildings and rebuilt the city nearby and named it roughly better than Antioch because Khosrau built this just to spite the Byzantines. A lot of the countries in the British and Dutch empires were actually conquered and run by private companies. Also, New York was originally called New Amsterdam, and Wall Street is where a wall was built to keep out Native Americans, pirates and the British. During World War II, a Syrian brown bear cub named Wojtek was bought and adopted by a group of Polish soldiers who had just escaped the USSR. He became such an integral member of the 22nd Artillery Company that he was registered as a private so that the army could provide him rations. At the Battle of Monte Cassino, he helped carry ammunition crates, and he became something of a celebrity among Allied forces. After the war, he retired to the Edinburgh Zoo. The Roman Emperor Commodus tried to rename Rome, Commode, after himself, tried to rename the Romans, Commodans, again, after himself, and would dress as Hercules and dress up crippled war veterans as monsters and beat them to death in the Colosseum. Publicly. The Romans, the Commodans, did not take it very well. In 1956, a man named Tommy Fitzpatrick stole a small plane from New Jersey for a bet and then landed it perfectly on the narrow street in front of the bar he had been drinking at in Manhattan. 2 years later, he did it again after someone didn't believe he had done it the first time. What's also crazy is that the punishment for the first time ended up being only a $100 fine, since the charges were dropped by the owner of the plane, and the second resulted in only 6 months in jail. That Mad Jack Churchill, no relation to Winston, I think, was an epic crazy boss of a man who more people should know about. He hunted Nazis with a sword and a bow and arrow in the middle of battles like D-Day. When Stalin and Hitler made an agreement, there was a news art in which it showed Hitler in a tuxedo and Stalin in a wedding dress. Alexander Pushkin's, the founder of modern Russian literature and by many considered the greatest Russian poet, great-grandfather was abducted as a kid in Cameroon and brought to Russia. He later presented a gift to Peter the Great, by whom he was then freed and adopted. He was raised as his godson. He was black. The sandwich was invented purely out of some dude's gambling addiction. He didn't want to stop playing cards to eat, so he had the chef make something he could eat with his hands. When Liechtenstein went to their last military engagement in 1886, none of their 80 soldiers were hurt or killed. They actually came back with 81 men as they made an Italian friend on the way. Phosphorus and the flammable match heads were discovered/invented when a bloke boiled some piss trying to get gold out it. The only way of getting phosphorus before the modern industry was collecting piss from hundreds of people. Approximately 25% of Aztec DNA comes from Polynesians. There are very similar linguistic ties between languages in Fiji and Mexican indigenous languages. Almost everyone is familiar with the calling of a horse race since it is one of the most important and exciting parts of horse racing. However, not many people actually know the origin of it. It's pretty obvious that it had to start somewhere, but where exactly? Well, on February 5, 1927, the film Sunset Derby was being shot at the Tijuana racetrack. A track official noticed the way a director was using a microphone and a loudspeaker to direct his crew and actors during the filming. The idea came to him that if he had a microphone set up in the steward's booth that led to a set of speakers, he could call out the positions of the horses. Later that day, he had it set up without telling any of the patrons to the track about it. Back then people would follow the horses themselves with binoculars and often were unable to get a great view at certain angles until the stretch. When people first experienced it that day, they were extremely confused because all of a sudden there was this voice booming over the track. After they got used to it, they loved hearing a race being called and it became an everyday thing at that small track. Now, it's an extremely important part of modern-day racing all across the world that has led to hilarious moments like the famous "My Wife Knows Everything" call, and it all started at that small Mexican track. Charles-Henri Sanson was the executioner of Paris under Louis XVI's rule. He was the offspring of an entire family that took executioner positions all over France. He was related to the executioners of Lyon, Marseille and other places. He inspired Joseph Ignace Guillotin to develop the guillotine, although there have already been machines with similar functions, like the Scottish Maiden, after explaining to him the logistic effort that goes into his task. Before the guillotine, beheadings by the sword were common, and such needed a sharpened blade for each delinquent and a skillful executioner to hit the mark properly to end the delinquent clean and fast. Before the French Revolution, he was the executioner of the king, and when Louis and his family were sentenced to death, he was, well, the executioner of the king and queen and the crown heirs. However, he was also the man who executed Robespierre. The last two soldiers in the Japanese army from World War II did not surrender until 1974. For one, they had to go and find his superior officer from the war and fly him out to the Philippines to give him the order to stand down. In the early 20th century, two rival spies who had sworn to kill each other joined forces to try and launch a hippo ranching scheme in the Louisiana Bayou. A large fraction of soldiers in the American Revolutionary War were Germans. They fought on both sides. The first atomic test was at the Trinity site, just east of San Antonio, New Mexico. While this was a top-secret test, the people working at the site tipped off the townsfolk they'd gotten close to take a look east at about 5:30 a.m. on July 16, 1945. Also, The people that worked there had a legit fear that the atomic reaction would be never-ending and that they could cause the end of our world with the detonation. Long story short, Kellogg's cereal was originally invented basically as a masturbation preventative. There's a great Dollop podcast episode about it. Contrary to popular belief, the Caesar salad was not invented by Julius Caesar but rather traces its origins back to Italian-American restaurateur Cesar Cardini, who invented the salad in 1924 in Tijuana, Mexico at his restaurant, which served as a tourist destination to attract Americans frustrated by Prohibition. The exact story is disputed, but the general consensus is that over the 4th of July weekend, Cardini threw together a bunch of ingredients he had on hand and served his concoction to his friends. Supposedly Cardini's brother, Alex, came to Tijuana in 1926 and added anchovies to the salad. The great American dancer, singer/actor, Fred Astaire had to record the sounds of his tapping feet after he had filmed the dance sequences. In the early years, 30s, 40s, Hollywood sound engineers couldn't isolate the tap sounds, so Fred and Ginger had to recreate the sounds in post-production. That makes his cinematic achievements that much more impressive to my mind. I got this fact from Astaire's autobiography Steps in Time. Tomatoes were thought to be poisonous and associated with witchcraft. Not so cool, more horrifying, but, before Christopher Columbus, there was no record of syphilis in European countries. There was also no record of syphilis in Native Americans. The only creature that had syphilis was llamas. There were Jewish who supported Hitler and agreed with killing the Russian Jews. Some were made honorary Aryans, like Hitler's driver. The highest ranked was a field marshal, Erhard Milch, with a Jewish father, which the Nazis lied about and said he was a product of incest. Fewer years passed between Cleopatra's birth and the moon landings than between her birth and the building of the Great Pyramids. Normandy gets its name from a band of Vikings that was granted territory in northern France in exchange for protecting the French lands. The descendants of those Vikings, the Normans, would end up conquering England while still keeping their French lands, bringing England in direct contact with mainland Europe. This would much later lead to the 100 Years' War between England and France, and animosity between the two countries that lasted until the modern age. Giving those Vikings land was possibly one of the worst deals in history. In 1814, while the British were burning Washington, D.C., the city was hit by a storm that dropped a tornado right into the heart of the city, killing several British soldiers. The storm ended up putting out most of the fires. As a DC area native, I always find the story interesting since tornadoes occurring within DC itself is rare, so it's just fascinating that one of the few times it occurs is during the only time in history that the US capital is occupied by foreign forces. People wonder why the Vikings named Iceland as the land of ice and Greenland as the green land, while Greenland is full of ice and Iceland not as icy as it's portrayed. It was a strategic move by the to protect their lands by raiders. The sound of an ice land sounds bad by raiders, while Greenland sounded like a rich land, so raiders would go to Greenland only to realize that they have been tricked. No wonder why they called Floki, founder of Iceland and Greenland, Floki the trickster. Mammoths only went extinct 10,000 years ago. It's thought they died out because of overhunting and natural climate change. And dodos went extinct in the 1600s. Many scientists believe the dodo didn't fear humans for some reason, though some believe it's because dodos didn't have any natural predators. They were incredibly easy to catch and were hunted to extinction. That the British once sunk an American ship, then salvaged wood, turned into a desk, and now it's the very desk that is sitting in the White House. Abraham Lincoln was an accomplished wrestler, only losing once in 300 matches. He was honored with an Outstanding American Award by the Wrestling Hall of Fame in 1992. Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States, was the only U.S. president who spoke English as a second language. His first language was Dutch. He was also the first president born after the states declared independence from Great Britain. Thomas Jefferson was scared of Angelica Schuyler, sister to Elizabeth Schuyler, after she by ch slapped him. He was so scared, in fact, that he would refuse to go to events and social gatherings in fear she would be there. The death of one man caused the start of modern history. Thank you for watching Reddit Space. Please subscribe if you love these Reddit stories.